Welcome to I Hear Things for May 14th, 2021. What happened to podcast listening in Canada? So one of my favorite aspects of my job is the ability to play detective. I'm no Inspector Lestrade from Sherlock Holmes or Ice-T from Law & Order, but I have my moments. Today, we're going to go all Ice-T on some infinite dial data. So this week, Edison Research released the fourth edition of our Infinite Dial Canada study, which is our annual benchmarking study of Canadian digital audio and podcast listening. We spent a long time making sense of this data to make sure it's as accurate and representative of the bilingual population of Canada as we possibly could. I spoke French. And there were a few surprises in there, which I'll get to in a moment. But first, I'll say that being able to conduct infinite dial studies in countries other than the U.S. is a real point of pride for us. And our goal with the infinite dial, it's always been twofold. Number one, spare no expense in sampling or methodology to make the infinite dial data the data of record for the topics it covers. And I think we achieved that. But second, we also replicate that methodology and the pernickettiness therein exactly in other countries, so that we have a way to compare things like podcast consumption from country to country without having to make any adjustments. By the way, I'd love to do an infinite dial study in every country, even in Micronesia or one of the other larger Nesias. We're adding new countries all the time as we find sponsors. And Triton Digital's been our partner in the U.S. for years, and they've also partnered with us in Canada from the beginning. As a result, we're able to produce these incredible graphs that show comparisons from country to country. For example, this year, from the first three infinite dial studies that we released in the U.S., Australia, and Canada, we can actually compare monthly podcast listening across those three countries amongst persons 18 plus. In the U.S., it's 40. In Australia, it's 37. And in Canada, it's 38. They're fairly equal across the board. There may be other studies of podcasting in those three countries, but I can confidently say this is the only real apples-to-apples comparison in the world of podcast listening in the U.S., Australia, and Canada, kind of compared to each other. This, of course, is the overarching story of the latest Canadian data, that podcast consumption in these three predominantly but not exclusively English-speaking countries, it's roughly equal, with around 4 in 10 adults, 18 plus, saying that they listen to podcasts every month. We saw continued growth in this stat in the U.S. and in Australia year over year, but we didn't really see growth in Canada. In fact, if you look at the trending for the last 3 years of Infinite Dial Canada data, I think you'd have little choice but to characterize that trend, at least in isolation, as flat. In 2019, 36% of Canadians 18 plus were monthly podcast listeners. In 2020, it was 37%, and this year, it's 38%. Now, we've seen other evidence to corroborate slower recent growth in Canada compared to the U.S., but it should also be noted that Canada was ahead of the U.S. back in 2019. So, if anything, the recent growth in American podcast listening has been a bit of a catch-up to Canada. Still, we wondered if there might not be something more to these data. Is the Canadian podcast market truly at a plateau, at a pause, an abeyance, an interregnum? Well, it's time to put away the thesaurus, and let's put on our detective hats. Now, I don't want to overstate this, but I also don't want to proceed here without noting that every country has had its own differential response to the global COVID-19 pandemic. And although we share the world's longest border, the U.S. and Canada have been affected differently, and that in turn has affected media consumption differently, to say the least. In the case of our infinite dial data, one of the key areas where we spot these differences is with in-car media consumption. So first, if you look at the American infinite dial study from the last year, and you just look at the audio sources currently ever used in the car, there's a couple of changes worth noting. There's a continued decline, but not quite death, of the CD player. There's a dip in AM/FM radio usage. And there's a slight increase in podcasts as an audio source that people currently use in the car. That went from 28% of those who have ridden or driven in the last month to 30% saying that they currently ever listen to podcasts in the car. For podcast producers, it's no doubt encouraging to see podcast listening increase by a couple of percentage points. But even that masks the overall growth in monthly podcast listening, which 12 plus grew even more, from 37% of Americans to 41% year over year. One of the variables that's in play here is a drop in actually being in cars. One of the things that we have tracked, and we have tracked a lot of these data since 1998, is the percentage of Americans who have driven or ridden in a car in the last month. That's what we base all of our in-car media consumption on. And that data reliably shows that the percentage of persons in America who have ridden in or driven a vehicle in the last month, it's generally in the high 80s, year over year, 88, 89, right in that range. In our most recent data, that dropped to 83%. Now, that's not a massive drop, but in the context of American life and a fairly stable stat, it's not a drop that we're accustomed to seeing. Now, let's look at these data for Canada. First of all, if we look at the audio sources used in the car, there's a couple things that really stick out. There's a big drop in CD player usage and owned music, yes, but there's also a drop in podcasting. The percentage of riders/drivers who say that they currently ever listen to podcasts in the car dropped from 27% last year to 20% this year. And this, for me, was the biggest eye-opener in the entire Canadian data set. Podcasting it's red hot, right? How could it possibly have gone down 7 percentage points in the car from 27% saying that they ever listen to podcasts in the car down to 20? Our first instinct, of course, being scientists, was to prove ourselves wrong. Was there a change in the question? Was there a flaw in the data? Did we miss something? But try as we might, we just couldn't prove this wrong. And the other in-car data tracked really, really well year over year. So it was just a thing. There was, however, an excellent explanation for these data lurking just below the surface. And here is where the differential effects of COVID-19 really emerge. While there was a modest and maybe unusual, but not huge drop in riding and driving in the U.S., thanks to pandemic-related disruptions, it was nothing compared to what we saw in Canada. Last year, in the Infantile Canada, the percentage of Canadians 18 plus who had ridden in or driven a car in the last month was 92%. This year, 77%. Now, the 2020 figure might have been a bit of a spike at 92%. It's also generally in the mid to high 80s. But even compared to 2019, it's a much more significant decline in vehicle usage than we observed in the U.S. And it's a lower in-car figure, period. In any case, car usage and being in a car dropped over 15% year over year. And that drop, by the way, was not equally distributed across the population. In fact, if you look at official statistics that were released by the Canadian government, and this is linked in the newsletter, the very youngest end of the workforce was hit the hardest. By April of last year, employment among Canadians 15 to 24 had dropped 50%, and it's still not recovered. Fewer jobs equals less commuting equals less time in cars. And if you live in one of Canada's most populous cities, like Toronto, for instance, there's a very good chance that you, like me here in Boston, have not even opened a car door for months. And our data shows that very clearly, and it shows that differential on the young end. We have posted in the Infantile Canada a chart of those who have driven or ridden in a car in the last month by age, and we've trended that over time. And the biggest drop by far is 18 to 34. Last year, 89% of Canadians 18 to 34 had driven or ridden in a car in the last month. That went from 89% last year to 66% this year. That's a 26% drop in riding in or driving a car year over year. Well, guess who listens to a lot of podcasts? And guess who's responsible for driving much of the growth in podcasting over the past few years? You don't have to be a detective to guess that. It's younger people. And so we return to the monthly podcast statistics, which again show that among Canadians 18 plus, listening nudged up from 37 to 38% monthly. But this was in the face of the percentage of in-car podcast listening plummeting. And that percentage of people who say they currently ever listen to podcasts in the car dropped by a third, thanks in at least some part to younger drivers quite literally having a container for listening removed from their lives. Now, I like to think about listening in terms of these containers. In-car listening, it's a container. The average commute dictates how long that container is. It doesn't have to dictate how long your podcast is, but that's the container, right? For many of us who either saw their employment hours reduced or able to be shifted to the home, that listening container simply went away. And given how COVID disproportionately affected the employment of younger Canadians, it also disproportionately affected those listening containers. And what those younger Canadians typically filled those containers with, well, was a lot of podcasts. As we acclimated to mid-pandemic life, we created new containers. Once we all got behind our communal viewing of Tiger King, we sorted out new containers for me time, I like to call it, to carve out space in our homebound lives. And for some, that was late at night. For others, a long walk. For others, it was lunchtime, which used to be an experience many shared with their coworkers. In any case, Canadians found those new containers. How do I know this? Because even in the face of the percentage of Canadians who currently ever listen to podcasts in the car dropping from 27% to 20%, monthly podcast listening didn't drop at all. So while our detective work never ends here at Edison, I think we can pretty convincingly say that in the case of monthly podcast listening in Canada, flat is not flat. Flat, in fact, might even be up, at least outside of the car, which might portend hidden pent-up demand once more young Canadians are fully back on the road again. Another topic for this week, which I've subtitled, My Podcast is for Everyone. It was a busy week for me between the aforementioned Infinite Dial Canada. I co-hosted the Spring 2021 Up Next podcast event from Sounds Profitable. There'll be links in the show notes. And I spoke about the current state of audio at the IAB Podcast Upfront, which is an event where all of the leading podcast networks kind of show their upcoming wares for advertisers to spend money on upfront, hence the name. I listened to a lot of the pitches for new upcoming podcasts at that event. And one announcement really jumped out at me, and it was the announcement of Seth Rogen's new podcast, which is going to come out this year from SXM Media, who's a great client of ours. Even if I weren't a Seth Rogen fan, I'd probably be all in on this show solely for the production and the sound design of Richard Parks III, who's going to be involved. And if you have not listened to Richard's Famous Foods podcast and the loopiness therein, it's a delightful show, and I can't wait to hear that bizarreness on Rogen's podcast. I was struck, however, by, and again, we're talking about Seth Rogen here, not the otherwise differently spelled Joe. I was struck by Seth Rogen's answer to this question in his IAB showcase. He was asked, who is this podcast for? And his answer was one that I think many of us would give or would like to give. I think it's for everybody. Well, here's my step-by-step way to succeed at making a show that's for everybody. Step 1, already be Seth Rogen. I was chatting about this with my wife, Tamsin, and she keenly observed that when we say that something is for everybody, we're missing the second half of that sentence. It's for everybody like me. A Seth Rogen show isn't going to be for everybody. It might be for me, it might be for you, I don't know, but it might not be for devout Christians. It might not be for the popular kids at school from, hence freaks and geeks. It might not be for people who are strongly against recreational drugs or the abuse of hot dogs or North Korea, etc. We all have a lens. And when we think our show is really for everybody, all we are really saying is that we haven't read the label of the jar that we're in. One of the most valuable things I think you can do as a podcaster, if you think that your show is for everybody, is to get some real clarity on just who everybody really is. It's people like you. And to get as specific about that as you can. The more cleanly you can codify that and really lean into that, the more likely it is that you're going to get the results that you think you're going to get. I have no doubt that Seth Rogen knows exactly who he is. And his version of everybody is actually pretty tightly focused. Narrow focus equals broad results. But it is the answer to that question, who is this show for, that most reveals the gaps in a podcaster's thinking. That topic is going to return to this podcast and to the newsletter. And as I mentioned last week, my wife and I are continuing to plan out a workshop or small group project that will incorporate both of our experiences into helping podcasters gain that clarity about their project. But I'll give you a couple of tips for a head start. First of all, make a list of who your show is not for. Make it a long, long list. The longer and more detailed, the better. Then you might be ready to truly think about who it's for. Second, It is your last chance to get the pre-order bonuses before Tamsin's book, Find Your Red Thread, drops on Monday. I'll leave a link for that in the show notes. I guarantee there is gold in there for podcasters to get clarity on exactly how to pitch and communicate the value of your show. And forgive me for the advertisement here in the podcast. It's for my wife. I love my wife. That's it for this week. I'm going to be hosting a new research webinar next week, the week of May 17th. And in fact, the webinar will be on May 18th, and it's going to be the first definitive look at who is using Clubhouse. Leave a link in the show notes. There'll be another edition, of course, of I Hear Things, the newsletter and the podcast. And if you'd like to support either, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Tom Webster. Subscribe if you haven't already, and tell a friend. That's it for this week. Thanks for listening to I Hear Things, and we'll see you next week.